March 23, 1943. El Guettar, Tunisia. 6 o'clock in the morning. Fog sits low across the wadi floor, thick enough to swallow the sound of engines before anyone can place their direction. Private first-class soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division crouch in shallow gun pits east of the Gafsa Road, watching the gray wall of mist for shapes that shouldn't exist yet. Somewhere behind that fog, the ground is already trembling. 60 tanks of the Italian Centauro Armored Division and the German 10th Panzer Division are moving toward them in the dark, following a plan drawn weeks earlier by a commander who is no longer even in Africa. Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen has placed his 1st Infantry Division across the only road a mechanized force can use to break into the American rear, and behind the infantry, gunners of the 601st and 899th Tank Destroyer Battalions sit low in their M3 and M10 vehicles, engines off, waiting. At 6:30, the fog begins to lift in patches, and the first tanks appear less than 1,000 yards away, already inside the range where the newest American doctrine says the battle should be decided. 2 nights earlier, in the darkness of March 21st, soldiers of the 1st Ranger Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel William O. Darby had climbed silently through the Djebel el Ank Pass south of El Guettar, moving on foot through terrain the Italian defenders considered impassable to any organized force, and struck their positions from behind at dawn. Darby's men moved through nearly 10 miles of broken, rocky terrain in a single night, carrying only what they could march with, and struck the Italian positions on the pass at first light, on the 21st, with enough surprise to seize the high ground almost intact, opening the southern approach to El Guettar for the rest of the corps to exploit in the days that followed. It is a small action compared to what follows 2 days later, but it matters, because it reflects the same underlying shift that will decide the larger battle. American units in this sector are no longer waiting passively for the enemy to choose the terms of engagement. That quiet infiltration, more than any single act of the coming battle, told the American command something the enemy did not yet know it had revealed: that the ground everyone assumed was safe was no longer safe, and that the corps preparing to receive Rommel's armor was not the same corps that had been surprised in the mountains 5 weeks before. Now, on the morning of the 23rd, the guns wait in silence for the tanks to close the distance. Gun crews check range cards one last time, by feel rather than by sight, the fog still too thick to read markings clearly. Somewhere down the line, an officer passes a whispered order not to fire until the lead vehicles cross a stretch of open ground already marked and ranged the day before. Nobody speaks above a murmur. 5 weeks earlier, in the mountains north of here, a wait like this one had ended in retreat. Nobody in the gun pits knows yet whether it will end the same way this time, only that the plan they have rehearsed for 2.5 weeks is about to be tested against the enemy it was built to answer. Within the hour, this stretch of Tunisian desert will answer a question that has followed the U.S. Army since Kasserine Pass 5 weeks earlier: whether American soldiers can stand and break a German armored attack built on the same principles that shattered them the last time these two forces met. The answer that morning will surprise commanders on both sides, including one field marshal who is not there to see it, and who insisted, before he left, that this exact plan could not fail. The popular version of this story gives Erwin Rommel a dramatic personal confrontation with George Patton, the Desert Fox, warning his staff that this new American commander fights with a doctrine unlike anything German intelligence had prepared for. It is a clean story, and it fits the legend both men eventually became. But the documented record tells something more interesting. Rommel is not at El Guettar on March 23rd. He has not been in North Africa for 2 weeks. Exhausted, ill, and increasingly certain that Hitler will never authorize the withdrawal he believes necessary to save the Afrika Korps, Rommel departs Tunisia on March 9, 1943, and never returns to African soil. He never personally faces George Patton in battle. What he leaves behind is something more revealing than a private warning to his officers. He leaves behind his own plan, built on principles he trusted completely, handed to subordinates who execute it exactly as designed. And it is that plan, Rommel's plan, tested without Rommel present, that breaks against a version of the American army he had already written off 5 weeks earlier as beaten and unlearned. The legend of a personal duel is not what happened. What happened is stranger. A general's own doctrine, failing a final exam, he never has to sit for himself. Part of why the personal duel version endures is a separate piece of popular culture that has nothing to do with El Guettar at all. Decades after the war, a line enters the public imagination through the 1970 film Patton, in which the American general, watching a German counterattack through binoculars, mutters, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book." It is one of the most quoted lines in war cinema, and it has been repeated so often in documentaries and popular histories that many assume it reflects a documented wartime moment. There is no reliable record of Patton saying anything resembling it during the Tunisian campaign. What is documented is something quieter and, in its way, more telling. Patton had genuinely studied Rommel's pre-war writings on infantry tactics, and he respected Rommel's reputation enough to reference him in private correspondence and diary entries. The admiration was real. The battlefield confrontation the line implies was not. Rommel and Patton study each other's doctrine from a distance, through intelligence reports and captured manuals, without ever standing on the same battlefield at the same time, and El Guettar is the clearest proof of that gap between the myth and the record. By early 1943, Rommel's reputation among Allied soldiers has already taken on a shape closer to legend than to any ordinary enemy commander. British troops who had fought him across Egypt and Libya for nearly 2 years call him the Desert Fox, a nickname that carries genuine respect alongside its wariness. And newly arrived American units in Tunisia inherit that reputation secondhand, through rumor and through British liaison officers who describe Rommel's armor tactics in near mythical terms, before American troops have ever faced them directly. Churchill himself had praised Rommel's boldness in a wartime speech to the House of Commons, a moment often cited as unusual for how openly it credited an enemy commander's skill. That reputation matters for understanding what happens next, because it means American soldiers arriving in Tunisia in early 1943 are, in a real sense, facing a legend before they face a man. And the shock of Kasserine Pass, when it comes, lands on troops already primed to expect something close to invincibility from the forces opposing them. To understand why El Guettar matters, the story has to start at Kasserine Pass, because that is where Rommel forms the judgment that shapes everything that follows. The trouble begins on February 14, 1943, when German armor strikes American positions around Sidi Bouzid, catching elements of the 1st Armored Division badly deployed on open ground, with poor mutual support between their tank, infantry, and artillery units. Within 2 days, Sidi Bouzid falls, and the Faid Pass, a critical gap through the eastern dorsal mountains, is firmly in German hands. American counterattacks launched to retake the lost ground are themselves cut apart by German anti-tank guns, using tactics the U.S. Army has not yet learned to recognize, drawing American tanks onto prepared gun lines and destroying them at range before they can close. By February 19th, the offensive widens, and Rommel's Afrika Korps, reinforced by elements of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions under Hans-Jürgen von Arnim's Army Group Africa, drives through American positions in the western dorsal mountains toward the Kasserine Pass itself. The U.S. Takken Corps, commanded by Major General Lloyd Fredendall, has never faced German armor in a coordinated attack before, and the result is close to collapse. American tanks of the 1st Armored Division are caught in open ground and destroyed in large numbers. Infantry positions break under combined tank and infantry pressure, Supply dumps are abandoned. Entire battalions retreat in disorder through the pass that gives the battle its name, and for several days, it appears that Rommel might drive all the way to the Allied supply base at Tebessa. American losses are severe. Several thousand killed, wounded, captured, or missing, along with dozens of tanks, artillery pieces, and half-tracks lost in the retreat. It is, without exaggeration, the worst defeat suffered by American ground forces against the German army in the entire war. Rommel's private assessment of American fighting ability after Kasserine is blunt and dismissive. He judges the American units green, poorly led, and tactically naive, brave individually, according to reports reaching him, but incapable of the coordinated response that veteran German formations expect from an opponent. Fredendall's command style, criticized even by his own superiors for issuing orders from a bunker far behind the lines and micromanaging units he cannot see, only reinforces German confidence that American generalship has not yet caught up with German battlefield doctrine. Among the Americans captured during the retreat is Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, an armor officer serving with the 1st Armored Division, and, as it happens, Patton's own son-in-law, taken prisoner near Sidi Bouzid and held for the remainder of the war. The connection is not widely known at the time, but it adds a private, personal weight to the defeat for the man who will take command of the corps just weeks later. Rommel pushes for a deeper exploitation of the breakthrough, arguing to von Arnim and to Field Marshal Albert Kesselring that the moment favors a bold drive north. He is overruled. Kesselring and von Arnim prefer a more cautious course, worried about overextending supply lines this deep into Tunisia, with British 8th Army pressure building from the east. The disagreement between Rommel and his colleagues over how far to press the advantage becomes one of the more consequential command disputes of the entire North African campaign. Rommel wants to keep driving north and west, believing the disorganized American retreat offers a rare chance to threaten Allied supply and rear area installations on a scale that could delay the entire Tunisian campaign by weeks. Von Arnim and Kesselring, weighing the risk of overextending armored spearheads without secure fuel and ammunition, resupply this far from the coast, argue for consolidating the gains already made, rather than gambling further. The dispute is never fully resolved in Rommel's favor, and it leaves him privately convinced that Kasserine's true potential was never realized, not because the American army stopped him, but because his own side hesitated at the critical moment. Rommel withdraws his forces back through the passes by February 25th, frustrated that what he considers a rare opportunity has been wasted by more conservative colleagues. But the judgment he carries out of Kasserine stays fixed in his mind. The American army in Tunisia, as it currently stands, does not yet know how to fight a modern armored battle. What Rommel does not fully account for is how quickly Eisenhower moves to change that. Within days of the Kasserine retreat, Fredendall is relieved of command, a decision Eisenhower has been considering even before the battle, based on reports of Fredendall's remote leadership style and friction with subordinate commanders. But Kasserine makes the decision final. On March 6, 1943, Major General George S. Patton takes command of 2nd Corps, and the transformation he imposes in the following 2.5 weeks becomes one of the most studied leadership turnarounds of the North African campaign. Patton arrives convinced that Fredendall's corps has lost its discipline as much as its confidence, and he treats both as the same problem. He orders strict enforcement of uniform regulations, helmets worn at all times, neckties required even in forward areas, leggings buttoned, not as vanity, but as a visible, immediate signal that standards have returned. He fines officers on the spot for violations he witnesses personally, driving the corps front in his own vehicle to inspect units without warning. He orders aggressive combat patrolling to restore initiative at the platoon and company level, rather than the passive defensive posture that characterized the corps before Kasserine. And critically, he pushes hard on integrating the Army's new tank destroyer doctrine. Massed, mobile anti-tank guns, held in reserve, and rushed to threatened sectors, rather than distributed thinly along the line. A concept that existed on paper before Patton arrived, but had never been tested under his direct, hands-on insistence that artillery, infantry, and tank destroyers coordinate as a single system, rather than three separate branches reacting independently. Patton moves his own headquarters well forward of where Fredendall had kept it, a deliberate signal that the Corps commander now shares the same risk as the men he commands. He is known to appear unannounced at forward positions in his own jeep, personally correcting officers he finds out of uniform regardless of rank, and issuing an order that becomes near legend within the Corps. No further American retreat without written authorization from Corps headquarters. Omar Bradley, placed alongside Patton as his deputy at Eisenhower's direction, partly to temper Patton's more theatrical instincts with Bradley's quieter, methodical judgment, spends these weeks visiting frontline units personally, assessing readiness in a way Fredendall's staff rarely had. Bradley, serving as Patton's deputy corps commander during this period, later describes the change in Corps morale as one of the fastest he witnesses in the entire war. Not because Patton is loved, but because soldiers respond to visible, enforced standards after weeks of confusion and retreat. Whether the German High Command in Tunisia fully registers this transformation is a separate question, and the evidence suggests they do not. Rommel's information about the American reorganization is fragmentary at best. He has left Africa believing he understands the American army he fought at Kasserine, without direct knowledge that the Corps he studied no longer exists in the same form. Before Rommel departs, he authors one final offensive concept for the southern Tunisian front, a plan intended to strike westward against American positions around Gafsa and El Guettar, disrupting any Allied threat to the flank of the Mareth Line, where the bulk of his forces face Montgomery's British Eighth Army, advancing from Libya. The concept is straightforward and, on paper, sound by every principle Rommel has built his reputation on. Concentrate armor, achieve local surprise, strike a numerically inferior American force before it can consolidate its new positions, and force a withdrawal that protects the German southern flank. It is the same doctrine that worked at Kasserine 5 weeks earlier. Armor punching through before infantry and artillery can properly coordinate a defense. Rommel hands responsibility for the operation to his subordinates as he prepares to leave for Germany, still believing, based on everything he has seen so far, that the American army opposing this plan is the same one his forces broke in February. He departs North Africa on March 9th, traveling first through Rome for a strained meeting with Mussolini, who does not share his assessment that Tunisia is unwinnable, before continuing on to East Prussia to meet Hitler directly. Rommel intends, he believes, to argue for a strategic withdrawal of Axis forces from Tunisia altogether, convinced that continuing to reinforce a shrinking bridgehead with no realistic supply line across the Mediterranean will only trade more men and equipment for a defeat that is already inevitable. Hitler refuses to authorize any withdrawal and, by several accounts, receives the suggestion badly. Exhausted, suffering from skin infections and circulatory problems that have troubled him for months, Rommel is effectively sidelined, sent on medical leave rather than returned to his command, while von Arnim formally takes over as commander of Army Group Africa. He never returns to command troops in Africa again. The plan he leaves behind outlives his presence, and it is executed on March 23rd, against an American corps that, in the 2.5 weeks since he last studied it, has been rebuilt from the ground up by George Patton. The Battle of El Guettar begins in the dark hours before dawn on March 23rd, when the 10th Panzer Division, now under the command of Major General Friedrich Freiherr von Broich, following the death of his predecessor in a landmine explosion weeks earlier, advances westward along the Gabes-Gafsa road with the Italian Centauro Armored Division in support. Their objective is the American-held high ground and roadblock positions east of El Guettar, defended by Terry Allen's 1st Infantry Division, along with elements of the 1st Armored Division, and, critically, the newly reorganized tank destroyer battalions that Patton has insisted be positioned forward and ready to concentrate, rather than scattered thin. As the fog begins lifting after 6:30, the lead German and Italian tanks come into range of the American gun line before their own reconnaissance has properly located it. The same kind of intelligence gap that doomed American units at Kasserine now working in reverse. American 105mm howitzers and the towed and self-propelled tank destroyers of the 601st and 899th Battalions open fire from prepared positions, catching the attacking armor in a crossfire across open desert terrain with almost no cover. The fighting through the morning is brutal, and at several points, desperately close. German tanks push to within a few hundred yards of American infantry positions, before artillery fire and tank destroyer rounds begin taking a heavy toll on the attacking formation. Several American gun crews hold their positions under direct tank fire, refusing orders to withdraw, trusting that the mass of supporting artillery Patton has insisted be pre-registered on likely approach routes will arrive in time. It does. Concentrated American artillery fire, coordinated through forward observers directly with the guns in a way that had broken down badly during Kasserine, begins falling on the attacking columns with a speed and accuracy that German after-action reports later describe as unexpectedly effective. By mid-morning, the Centauro Division's armor has been badly mauled, losing dozens of tanks to a combination of tank destroyer fire, artillery concentrations, and American minefields laid in the days before the attack. The 10th Panzer Division fares only somewhat better, but its own advance stalls under the same combination of fires, unable to break through the American line before its own losses make continuing the attack unsustainable. By afternoon, the German and Italian commanders on the ground recognize that Rommel's plan, sound as it appeared when he drafted it, has run directly into an American force that no longer resembles the one described in the intelligence Rommel departed with. Several Centauro tanks are reported knocked out within a few hundred yards of the American gun line, close enough that crews on both sides can see each other's muzzle flashes through the settling dust. American minefields, laid deliberately along the most obvious tank approaches in the days before the attack, funnel part of the German-Italian armor into the pre-registered artillery zones, rather than around them, exactly as Patton's staff had planned. By early afternoon, the attack is called off, with von Broik's forces withdrawing east under continued American artillery fire, leaving a battlefield littered with burned-out tanks. American estimates place German and Italian armor losses at over 30 tanks destroyed or disabled in a single day, though exact figures vary between sources, alongside several hundred Axis casualties. American losses, while real, are significantly lighter, and critically, the line holds. For the first time in the North African campaign, a major German armored attack, built on Rommel's own operational principles and aimed at an American corps, is stopped cold on the defensive, not through American numerical superiority, which does not yet exist in this sector, but through discipline, coordination between artillery and anti-tank forces, and a doctrine that did not exist in this corps 5 weeks earlier. The Germans attempt renewed pressure against American positions around El Guettar over the following days, including a costly and prolonged struggle for the high ground American troops call Hill 336, where infantry from the 1st Infantry Division's 18th Infantry Regiment fight for several days of close combat, often at grenade and bayonet range along the crest, to hold the position against repeated German counterattacks. Artillery falls almost continuously on the ridge through this stretch of fighting, and the regiment's ability to hold the position despite the pressure becomes, in Patton's own assessment, further proof that the corps rebuilt since Kasserine can now absorb a sustained German effort without breaking, something that would have been in serious doubt 5 weeks earlier. Fighting around El Guettar continues in a lower intensity form. for nearly 2 more weeks, through the end of March and into early April, as both sides probe for weaknesses along a front that has effectively stabilized. German reports from the sector during this period note, with some concern, the effectiveness of the towed and self-propelled American tank destroyers against armor that had previously operated with near impunity against earlier American formations. A marked change in tone from the assessments written after Kasserine, only weeks before, when German officers had described American gunnery and coordination as inconsistent and easily exploited. The M10 tank destroyer, still a relatively new addition to American units in this theater, proves capable of engaging German medium tanks at ranges that had not been fully anticipated in German planning for the operation, and the pre-registered artillery fire plans Patton insisted on drilling in the weeks before the battle continue to blunt German probing attacks well after the main assault of March 23rd has ended. But the decisive moment of the battle remains the morning of March 23rd, when Rommel's armored concept, executed faithfully by his successors, fails against exactly the kind of integrated defense his own earlier assessment insisted the Americans were incapable of building. Patton, monitoring the battle from his Corps headquarters, later credits the tank destroyer doctrine and the artillery coordination developed in the weeks since Kasserine as the deciding factors, and the action at El Guettar becomes one of the formative case studies the U.S. Army uses to validate the massed tank destroyer concept moving forward into the Sicily and Italy campaigns. Back at the gun pits east of the Gafsa Road, as the smoke clears from the last German tanks pulling back into the haze they emerged from at dawn, the soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division and the tank destroyer crews who held their ground do not yet know the scale of what they have accomplished. They know only that the attack has stopped, that the guns are still theirs, and that for the first time since the retreat through Kasserine 5 weeks earlier, they have not been the ones falling back. Word passes down the line through the afternoon that the Corps commander himself, Patton, has been forward watching parts of the fight, and that the artillery plan he insisted on drilling relentlessly in the weeks before the battle is the reason the guns found their targets so quickly. None of them know that the attack plan they just defeated carries Rommel's design, or that the field marshal who authored it is, at that very hour, in a meeting with Hitler in East Prussia, arguing for a withdrawal from a theater he still believes his forces can dominate on the ground. Rommel receives word of the failed attack at El Guettar within days, relayed through Kesselring's headquarters, and by every account it troubles him deeply, not merely as a tactical setback, but as evidence that the assumptions he carried out of Africa are already out of date. He never returns to command in Tunisia. Von Arnim assumes overall command of Axis forces in the theater, and the campaign continues for another 6 weeks, under mounting Allied pressure from both the West, where Patton's reorganized Second Corps continues pushing toward Gabes and eventually Bizerte, and the East, where Montgomery's 8th Army finally breaks the Mareth line. Patton himself does not remain to see the campaign's final act. In April, he is pulled from Second Corps to begin planning the invasion of Sicily, handing command to Bradley, who leads the Corps through the final weeks of fighting toward Bizerte and Tunis. By May 13, 1943, Axis forces in Tunisia surrender in their entirety. More than 250,000 German and Italian troops taken prisoner, a defeat that Allied commanders at the time compare in scale to the German disaster at Stalingrad only months earlier. The army Rommel built his reputation leading in Africa ceases to exist as an organized force, and the doctrine he trusted without reservation, concentrated armor, speed, surprise, proves, at El Guettar, to no longer be sufficient on its own against an opponent that has learned, in a matter of weeks, to answer speed with coordinated firepower. Patton carries the lessons of those weeks directly into Sicily, only months later, where tank destroyer coordination and aggressive, forward-positioned command become standard practice for the army he now leads, at full strength, no longer a corps, rebuilding from a single defeat, but a battle-tested force, with its own doctrine, to teach in turn. Many of the officers who served under him at El Guettar, men who had watched the corps transform in the span of a few weeks from a beaten formation into one capable of stopping Rommel's own design cold, go on to hold command positions through Sicily, Italy, and eventually Normandy, carrying with them a hard-earned understanding that the tactics which win one battle rarely survive unchanged into the next, and that the armies which endure are the ones willing to rebuild themselves between defeats rather than after them. What makes El Guettar significant is not that it erases Rommel's record as one of the most skilled armored commanders of the war. It does not. His campaigns in France and earlier in North Africa remain studied for good reason. What El Guettar demonstrates is something narrower and, in some ways, more important for understanding how armies actually learn. Doctrine is not a fixed advantage. It is a living system that has to be tested against an opponent who is changing in real time, and the army that adapts fastest between battles, not the army with the better plan on paper, often decides the next one. Rommel's plan for El Guettar was not reckless or poorly conceived. It followed principles that had won him battles across 2 continents. It failed because the men executing it were still fighting the American Army of February, while the American Army of March had already rebuilt itself around lessons Rommel never had the chance to observe firsthand. He left Africa 5 weeks before the test of his own doctrine, and the answer came back while he was arguing, without success, for a strategy Hitler would not permit until it was already too late to matter. The tank destroyer doctrine, tested that morning at El Guettar, would go on to shape American armored warfare through Sicily, Italy, and eventually Normandy. Imperfect, frequently debated, even within the U.S. Army itself, and revised again, more than once, as the Army encountered heavier German armor later in the war. Historians of American armored doctrine still debate how well the tank destroyer concept held up once the Army met Panther and Tiger tanks in Normandy and beyond, where thicker armor and longer-ranged German guns exposed weaknesses the doctrine had not fully anticipated. But at El Guettar in March 1943, against the force and the plan it was designed to defeat, it worked exactly as intended, and that early validation gave American commanders the confidence to keep refining it, rather than abandoning it outright. It was proven, on March 23, 1943, in a wadi outside a small Tunisian town, against a plan built by a field marshal who believed, right up until the moment he left the continent, that the rules he had written still applied. They did not. Rommel would go on to command again, in France, ahead of the Normandy invasion a year later, carrying forward the same core instincts for armor and speed, this time facing an American army that had continued evolving in the year since Tunisia, while he remained largely occupied elsewhere. The soldiers who held the gun line at El Guettar, most of them unnamed in any official history, are the reason the next chapter of the war in North Africa would not be written the way Rommel's original plan intended it to be, and their fight stands as one of the clearest lessons of the entire war, that no doctrine, however well proven, survives contact with an enemy that has been given even a few weeks to learn from its last defeat.